Hi, Chiwetel. Nice to meet you.
And
I'm Will from the New Black Film Collective. So
Hi,
thank you so much for taking the time to speaking with us.
pleasure.
First of all, congratulations on a fantastic film. I thought your performance was brilliant, really in transmitting the angst and horror of the film, and also the subtle sort of themes of self-reckoning. So really thank you for that. We just had a couple of questions about the film. First of all, what was your first reaction when you found out about Backrooms? Were you familiar with the YouTube series at all?
I was not. No, I didn't know anything about Backrooms. I was sent the script and the materials about it, just as sort of links to the web series, and so that was my first sort of deep dive. I'd heard a little bit about liminal spaces, but not that much, and um, and so I began in that order. Really, I sort of started with the web series, which
Hmm.
I loved. I just absolutely loved it, and I just thought it was ingenious. I just thought that what Kane had created was really spectacular, and it didn't surprise me at all that it had become so popular and people had really sparked something in the imagination. And then I read the script, which I equally thought was fantastic, and I just loved the combination of those elements.
For sure, no, and it's absolutely brilliant script, I can imagine. And in fact, we did ask Kane of what it was like to work with you, and obviously he said that it was great, so all positive there. And he said that it was great to work with someone who was interested in the film's mechanics, but also who did not go necessarily too deep on that, as there still needed to be space for the inner psychology of characters such as Clark.
Sure.
So, with that said, I was curious to ask, what was your experience of building this sort of very complex psychological story of Clark's character, whilst in the background there was this equally complex, but perhaps more sort of well elaborated and pre-existent world and space in the background emerging from the YouTube series.
Well, I think it was sort of based for me on what the backrooms are, and what they mean to Clark, and it felt like that was the point of connection for me is like why is it important that this person ends up in this place, and how is that communicated basically. So it always felt to me that he was somebody who well, two things. First of all, it always felt to me that the backrooms had a kind of organic quality to it. That is, that it can read and see and intuit people in a really sort of profound way, and that was part of, obviously that's part of the all of the series. So, what are the things that it reads and sees and understands about Clark, and that he immediately also recognizes that he is being understood and on some sort of fundamental level? And and why is that important to him? If he had other elements and other people in his life who he felt understood him or saw him, then obviously the draw of the backrooms wouldn't be as pronounced. But because he doesn't, and yet he is still a sort of, there is still something, to me anyway, that is optimistic, or at least sort of cautiously optimistic about Clark. And he does have these redeeming qualities, I think. I think he does demonstrate some elements of self-awareness and engagement, and there is moments of charisma, and there's things that are in him that I engage with, in the sense but those things might also be slightly for him a trap, in that he could be mistaken for believing that the backrooms recognizes those positive qualities in him and therefore wants to help him, as opposed to somebody who doesn't have any of those things, who is simply a kind of a sort of Ebenezer Scrooge kind of character. So doesn't feel that anything mystical would be positive for him. So so I thought it was kind of interesting to try to build that sort of psychology for Clark. Somebody
Mm,
who has all of the complications that he has some of the redeeming qualities that he has, then interacts with a space that convinces him that he is being seen.
for sure. That's really interesting. And I was thinking also of asking you, kind of touched a little bit on this already, but do you then feel that, or how do you feel about Clark's fate, therefore? Do you think that this is sort of the Backrooms is a fitting ending for a character of that, of with that psychology?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I don't want to cast anybody into the back rooms as a
No,
kind
sure. And
of,
also getting chewed off from your
yeah,
shoulder, perhaps. It's not the
yeah,
best ending for anyone.
exactly for anybody. But but it's, I think the back rooms is a, it, it's difficult because I don't want to dismiss it as being just a sort of the backrooms being a kind of malevolent force.
Sure.
But I do think that it does see people as they are, and so for all of the ways in which we kind of try to hide the sort of recesses of our problematic natures, the back rooms exposes them, and there's just no hiding from it. At a certain point, it's like it is a judgment, and to some degree, Clark does receive the judgment of this space. And so, whether one walks away thinking it was a deserved judgment or not, I think it was the judgment. You know what I mean? So
Yeah,
you gotta take that for what it is. It does seem appropriate.
for sure. Yeah, that's interesting that talking about a non-malevolent space, because I also was quite sort of drawn into it, just from the aesthetics of it and kind of the psychological nature of it. But I suppose, yeah, there is also a little bit of malignant forces to it. So yeah, I like that um, sort of balance there. Watching the film and watching Clark navigate his struggles, his marriage, kind of his problems with alcoholism, his career in decline. Do you think that leaves you with any reflections on masculinity, particularly on how Clark then experiences backrooms ultimately as a kind of safe space in the end of the film?
Yeah, I think I think it's yes. I definitely think that there's a kind of judgment about masculinity and the sort of traps of masculinity in a way, the sort of ego traps of masculinity, the sort of the kind of the that sort of capacity to flip just between silence and rage and not really being
Mm,
able to process or understand all of the kind of complex emotional dynamics that one is kind of going through, to stick on the moments when one is felt wronged and utilize that as a way of really sort of wielding a sword against everything, against the world, railing against everything, without processing it fully. Um, so, and to me, I think it is, it's that disconnect. It's a disconnect from grace in a way. From just being able to operate under kind of a certain, I guess it's too simple to say a kind of moral or ethical coding, but to really be able to rationalize one's and regulate one's emotions with other people in interpersonal relationships from a position of grace and generosity, and empathy. And I think once some of those elements have gone, or all of those elements have gone, then I think an individual, and I think men can be quite susceptible to this, become quite deregulated, and there is the capacity to feel quite disordered um, in a world, that you can't control or bend to your will with any success. So, and he feels those sorts of male pressures, to be the
Hmm.
provider, to be the sort of
Yeah.
to be the leader, and those are as well established pressures of masculinity, and the ways in which one deals with them, the ways in which one accepts some of them and dismisses others, um, and maintains balance, order, grace, empathy, and seeking help when needed. In order to do
Yeah.
those things, I do think has a kind of reflection on on masculinity, and in some ways contemporary masculinity. Even though it's set in the 1990s, it's like its conversation, I think, speaks very much to some of the complexity of masculinity today.
Hmm.
And some of it's and also the way that they interact reflects that as well. And so, yeah, that sort of gendered dynamic sits at the heart of the story, obviously, and yeah, and centers, I think, on masculinity and technology, and the way that
Hmm.
technology then sometimes offers this kind of balm or this kind of promise um, of understanding all of these issues, and so people can kind of disconnect from real life, real emotion, and go into, we are at the beginning of what I suppose in the future will be called the beginning of the technological age, and that will increasingly, the temptation would be, that if you are struggling to regulate all of these things, these pressures and emotions and so on, what you can do is disconnect from people almost entirely and just go into technology as your balm.
Hmm. Absolutely. That was really interesting. And actually, yeah, it is quite a current conversation, even though it's set in the 90s. Absolutely. So those were the only questions for Backrooms. I also just wanted to briefly ask you, could you tell us about any upcoming projects, or perhaps if you're excited to work on Children of Blood and Bone at all?
For sure. I mean, I love Children of Blood and Bone, and
Mm.
I love the book, and love working with, and it's an exceptional cast,
Yeah.
and Gina Prince Bythewood is a phenomenal director, who I've had the pleasure of working with before, and I think it's a really spectacular film, and I'm working on The Exorcist here in New York at the moment as well, with Mike Flanagan directing, um, and it's going to be very, very special. So I'm very excited about both of those projects, and can't wait for people to see them.
Fantastic. So we're very excited as well. Well, thank you so much for giving us your time. Chiwetel, it's lovely to meet you.
And you,
All the best for the rest of the year.
thank you, thank
Thank
you,
you.
thank you. Bye now.
Cheers. Bye bye.